I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to test my own husband. I always believed trust was the foundation of any relationship. And once you feel the need to check your partner, something was already broken. But here I was, fingers trembling, heart racing, as I created a fake social media account with a stranger's photo. Her name was Lily Harper. I picked the name on a whim, something simple but sweet. I scrolled through dozens of random profiles to find the perfect face. A woman pretty but not intimidatingly so. Someone who looked friendly, approachable. Her eyes had a warmth to them, a softness that put you at ease. The kind of woman you'd feel comfortable opening up to. It was all part of the plan. Why did I do it? Maybe I was bored. Maybe I was insecure. But if I'm being brutally honest, I think I was scared. Scared that after 7 years of marriage, something was slipping away. He'd been more distant lately. Not rude, not unkind, just elsewhere. His mind seemed preoccupied, his laughter less frequent. And every time I asked, "Is something wrong?" he'd reply, "No, I'm just tired." Tired. The most convenient excuse in the world. So I became Lily. I sent him a message on a platform I knew he used but wasn't overly active on. Just a simple, "Hey, I saw your profile. You seem interesting," smiley face. I waited. Minutes ticked by. I told myself he wouldn't respond. He wasn't like that. We had something solid. We weren't one of those couples. I put my phone down and walked away, shaking my head at my own paranoia. But when I checked back 20 minutes later, there it was. "Hey, thanks. Didn't think anyone actually messaged on here." My heart dropped into my stomach. I stared at the screen, frozen. My pulse echoed in my ears. I reread it over and over, trying to convince myself that it was innocent. It was innocent. Polite even. He didn't flirt. He didn't cross any lines. Not yet. But something had been unlocked. I typed back, fingers moving faster than my thoughts. "Well, I guess I'm not just anyone, winky face." I cringed as I hit send. I was trying too hard. He didn't respond right away, and for a moment I felt relief. Maybe he saw through it. Maybe he realized how stupid it was. Maybe he was busy. But a few minutes later. Haha, fair point. "So Lily, what do you do?" And that was how it started. First it was harmless. Surface level questions. "Where are you from? What do you do for work? Hobbies?" I mirrored my real self in small ways but kept Lily separate. She was fun and spontaneous. The kind of woman I'd imagine might intrigue a man who felt his life had become routine. And maybe that was part of the problem. Had I become routine to him? The first night I didn't feel guilty. I told myself it was just an experiment, a little social psychology game. I wanted to understand him, see if he'd fall for it. I didn't expect it to feel addictive. The next night I messaged him again. He responded almost instantly this time. Well, if it isn't my new mystery friend." I smiled. I shouldn't have smiled, but I did. There was something thrilling about being Lily. I could say things I wouldn't dare say as me. I asked bolder questions. "So, do you chat with women online a lot? Or am I special?" He replied with a laughing emoji and, "Special, definitely special." It was just a line. I knew that. But why did it sting? The following nights, our conversations grew longer, deeper. I asked him about his life, his thoughts on love, on family. He told Lily things I hadn't heard from him in months. How he sometimes felt like life was passing by too quickly. How he missed feeling young. How he sometimes worried he wasn't living up to his potential. These weren't confessions of a man looking to cheat. They were confessions of a man who felt stuck. And the worst part? I felt seen. As Lily, I said things I was too afraid to say as his wife. I asked him, "Do you ever feel like the person you love just forgets to look at you the way they used to?" He paused for a long time before responding. "Yeah, I think that happens to everyone after a while. It doesn't mean it's over though." I sat with that answer. I sat with it for hours. I wondered if he knew. Could he sense it was me? Was this his way of telling me he felt unseen too? But I didn't stop. Somewhere along the line, I wasn't doing it to test him anymore. I was doing it because I craved the version of him that I'd found in this chat. The open, thoughtful version. The man who stayed up until 1 a.m. texting about dreams and fears and stupid, what-if scenarios. I felt like I'd found a piece of him I'd lost. And I hated that it took Lily to get him back. On the 8th night, he sent something that shattered me. I'm not sure why, but I feel like I can be more honest with you than I am with most people. Even my wife. I stared at the message, my vision blurred with tears. I had asked for this. I'd poked and prodded, looking for cracks, and now I'd found one. I sat there broken, holding my phone like it might explode. I didn't respond that night. I didn't message him at all the next day. I felt hollow, sick. Was it me who failed him first? Was I so caught up in being right that I didn't realize he'd been trying to reach me for months? On the 10th night, I messaged him as me. Not Lily. Just me. I sat across from him at the dinner table, phone in hand. He was scrolling mindlessly, eyes on his screen. I typed, "Do you feel like we don't see each other anymore?" His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Then slowly he looked up at me. His face was unreadable. But his eyes had something I hadn't seen in a while. Recognition. "Yeah," he said, setting his phone down. "Yeah, ido." And just like that we started talking. Actually talking. No masks. No Lily. Just us. I confessed everything that night, the fake profile, the messages, the experiment that had spiraled out of control. I expected him to be furious. I expected yelling, accusations, maybe even the end. But instead he just sat there quietly listening. When I finished, he leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "You were brave enough to pretend to be someone else," he said softly. "But you never had to. I would have told you all of it if you just asked." I felt the tears before I realized I was crying. He reached out, his hand covering mine. We sat there for a long time in that quiet, shared guilt. That night there were no more secrets. We didn't fix everything in one conversation, but it was a start. I'd seen the man behind the screen, and for the first time in a long time I saw the man sitting in front of me. He wasn't perfect. Neither was I. But we were real. And that was enough. After that night, things weren't magically better. People like to think that a single heart-to-heart can heal all the cracks in a relationship, but that's not how it works. We had opened the door, yes, but now we had to step through it, both of us. The next few days felt raw, vulnerable. Every glance we exchanged carried more weight. Every pause in conversation felt like an opportunity for one of us to say something real. Sometimes we did, and sometimes we didn't. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said at the table. "You were brave enough to pretend to be someone else, but you never had to." It echoed in my mind constantly. Had I really been so afraid to ask him what he was feeling? Why did it take becoming Lily for me to listen? I didn't like the answer, but I knew it was the truth. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being curious about each other. We were living together but not seeing each other. And it's easy to blame him, to say he should have opened up first, to claim that I was just reacting to his distance. But that would be a lie. I had grown just as complacent as he had. I think that's the part that hurt the most. Realizing I wasn't the innocent one in all of this. A week after the confession, something shifted. It was subtle at first. One evening while we were both sitting on the couch, he put his phone down. Actually put it down and turned to me. I was scrolling through something meaningless, not even absorbing it, but I felt his eyes on me. "Hey," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Can I ask you something?" I blinked, turning toward him. "Of course." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and clasped his hands together like he was bracing himself. "If you could be anyone else for a day, who would you be?" I tilted my head, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "That's a random question." "Yeah," he shrugged, glancing down for a second. "But I'm curious." I thought about it for a moment. My first instinct was to say something playful like a celebrity or a millionaire, but that didn't feel right. Not with everything we'd just been through. So I answered honestly. "I think I'd want to be me," I said slowly, watching his face for a reaction. "But the me I used to be before everything got so heavy." His eyes met mine and I could tell I'd hit something. He nodded, looking thoughtful. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I get that." Silence hung between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like we were both finally standing in the same room instead of living in two separate worlds. I could feel the warmth of it, like the sun breaking through clouds after a long storm. That night, as we lay in bed, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He reached for me. Not in a sexual way, but just reached. His arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me closer. I felt his breath against my neck, steady and calm. "Hey," he whispered. "Yeah." I whispered back, my eyes still closed. "You don't have to be Lily for me to notice you." My chest ached in a way that wasn't painful but wasn't exactly comfortable either. It was that ache that comes with relief after holding your breath for too long. I didn't say anything. I just squeezed his hand, and that was enough. The days that followed were quiet but intentional. I stopped checking his phone when he left the room. He started asking me more questions, small ones like, "How was your day?" And big ones like, "What do you think we need to feel more us again?" We didn't have all the answers, but at least we were asking the questions. I deleted Lily's account a few days later. It felt ceremonial in a way, like closing a chapter I'd never planned on writing. But I didn't hate her. Lily had taught me something. She'd shown me that I'd been playing a role in my own marriage, the dutiful wife, the unquestioning partner. I'd been so focused on being good that I forgot to be real. One night, about 2 weeks after it all began, I was folding laundry on the bed when he walked in, still drying his hair from the shower. He glanced at me, something playful in his eyes. "So," he said, tossing the towel on the chair, "you think Lily would like me as much if she knew I never remember to hang up my towels?" I stared at him, caught off guard, and then burst out laughing. Real, genuine laughter. He grinned, walking over to me, arms wide. I tried to push him away, but he caught me, pulling me against him as I squirmed, still laughing. "Get off me, you're still wet," I protested, trying to wiggle free. "Too late," he said, squeezing me tighter. "You're stuck with me now." His voice had that same playful warmth I'd fallen in love with years ago. And I realized that somewhere in the mess of it all we'd found each other again. Later that night, as I lay in bed next to him, my mind drifted back to the beginning. To the fake messages. To the parts of him I'd seen that I hadn't noticed in so long. I realized something important then, something I wish I'd understood before. People change, even the people we think we know best. They evolve, sometimes in ways we don't see right away. But instead of waiting for them to explain themselves, maybe we need to be brave enough to ask. To notice. To be curious, not just about the world around us but about each other. I glanced at him as he slept beside me. His face was peaceful, his breathing steady. I reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair off his forehead. "Hey," I whispered, even though I knew he couldn't hear me. "I see you." And for the first time in a long time I felt seen too. The next few weeks felt like walking on fresh snow, cautious, deliberate, but undeniably beautiful. Every step left a mark, and every mark felt like progress. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no grand gestures, just a slow, quiet shift in the way we treated each other. Little things that used to go unnoticed suddenly felt significant. One evening, he did the dishes without me asking. I know that sounds trivial, but it wasn't. Usually, I'd have to remind him, or worse, silently stew in frustration until I did them myself. But that night, I walked into the kitchen to find him up to his elbows in soapy water, humming to himself like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Who are you and what have you done with my husband?" I teased, leaning against the counter. He glanced at me over his shoulder, a crooked grin on his face. "Figured I'd give you a night off," he said, like it was no big deal. But it was a big deal. Not because of the dishes, but because of the intention behind it. For so long we'd both been operating on autopilot, just going through the motions of marriage. You handle this, I handle that, repeat until the end of time. But this was different. It felt like he was choosing to see me again, not just as his wife, but as a person who deserved care and effort. Later that night, as we sat on the couch, I glanced at him from the corner of my eye. He was watching TV, his face relaxed, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping his knee in rhythm with the show's music. I felt a strange surge of affection, one that made me put my phone down and just watch him. Not with suspicion, not with questions, just with quiet love. "Hey," I said softly. He turned his head toward me, his eyebrows raised. "Yeah. Thanks for doing the dishes." His smile was small but genuine. "You don't have to thank me for that." "I know," I replied, tilting my head. "But I wanted to." Moments like that became more common. We stopped keeping score. No more mental tallies of who did what, who was winning or losing in the daily battle of responsibilities. We just showed up for each other. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but I started to feel like we were on the same team again. And that felt like everything. But there was one moment that stood out more than any other. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we were reorganizing the closet. I know, romantic, right? I had pulled out a box of old letters and cards we'd kept from our dating years. Most of them were silly notes, birthday cards, or little love letters we'd written when we were still in the honeymoon phase. I didn't even realize he was watching me until he crouched down beside me. "Forgot we still had all this," he said, picking up a crumpled note I'd left on his car windshield years ago. It said, "Don't forget to pick up dinner, but also I love you. Prioritize accordingly." He laughed, shaking his head. "You were so sassy back then." "Back then?" I shot him a playful glare. "You act like I lost it." "Nah," he said, smiling at me in that slow, deliberate way that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. "You didn't lose it. I think I just forgot to notice." I swallowed hard, pretending to be focused on the box of letters, but my chest felt tight. That one sentence hit me deeper than I expected. It wasn't just him admitting he'd missed something. It was a reminder that we both had. We'd stopped noticing each other. And somehow, in the mess of it all, we were finally waking up. That night, as we lay in bed, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. I reached for him first. I pressed my hand gently against his back, feeling the warmth of his skin under my palm. He shifted slightly, glancing back at me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Just wanted to touch you." He didn't say anything, but he reached back, lacing his fingers with mine. We stayed like that, hands entwined, until we both drifted off. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The experiment had started as a way to test him, to see if he would betray me. But in the end, it had revealed something else entirely, the cracks that neither of us had been brave enough to confront. I didn't need him to prove his loyalty. I needed him to see me again. And I needed to do the same for him. One evening, while we were cooking dinner together, I decided to tell him what I'd learned. He was chopping vegetables while I stirred a pot of pasta, the kitchen warm with the smell of garlic and tomatoes. It was one of those small, peaceful moments where everything feels steady, like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. "Can I tell you something?" I asked, glancing at him. "Sure," he said, not looking up from the cutting board. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, stirring the pot a little slower. I think I was lonelier than I realized." His knife stopped. He looked up at me, his eyes soft with concern. "When?" "Before," I admitted. "Before everything with Lily, before we started talking again. I think I felt like I didn't matter as much anymore." He set the knife down and wiped his hands on a towel. Slowly, he walked over to me, leaning against the counter beside me. "I know," he said quietly. "I felt it too." We stood there, side by side, the hum of the stove filling the silence. It should have been awkward, but it wasn't. It was honest. It was what we'd been afraid to say for so long, finally spoken out loud. He reached for my hand, his fingers curling around mine. "I don't want to feel like that again," he said. "I don't want you to feel like that again." I squeezed his hand, glancing up at him. "Me neither." We didn't need to say more. Sometimes, love isn't about grand gestures or big declarations. It's about the small promises you make and actually keep. It's about being brave enough to notice each other, even when it's easier to look away. That night, after we'd eaten dinner and cleaned up, I caught him sitting at the kitchen table, his phone in his hand. For a second, my heart jumped. Old habits die hard. But then I saw what he was doing. He was deleting old apps he didn't use anymore. The one where Lily had messaged him included. He glanced up, catching me watching him. He smiled, setting the phone down on the table. "Didn't need it anyway," he said simply. I smiled back, feeling a kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. I sat across from him, resting my chin on my hand. "You know," I said, tilting my head, "I think you're kind of stuck with me too." He leaned forward, his eyes crinkling with that same boyish grin he'd had when we first met. I wouldn't have it any other way. We stayed like that for a while, not talking, just sitting together. For once, there were no screens, no distractions, no Lily, and no pretending. Just us. The real us. The one we'd nearly forgotten about but had somehow managed to find again. I'm not saying everything was perfect after that. No one's love story is perfect. There are still hard days. There are still moments when we annoy each other, get too tired, or let old habits creep back in. But now we catch it. We notice it. And noticing is half the battle. The other half? It's choosing. Choosing to stay. Choosing to be curious. Choosing to keep reaching for each other. Even when it's easier to stay on opposite sides of the bed. That's the part no one tells you about love. It's not something you feel. It's something you choose over and over and over again. And every day we choose. The days turned into weeks and slowly our life began to feel lighter. It wasn't that everything was perfect or that we never argued, that would be unrealistic. But something fundamental had shifted between us. We had stopped living in survival mode. No more just getting through the day, as if marriage were a task to be checked off a list. We were present now. We noticed each other in ways we hadn't for years. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. That wasn't unusual. He always woke up before me and started the pot, but this time there was something different. The smell wasn't just coffee. It was pancakes. I stayed in bed for a moment, my eyes still closed, letting the warmth of the morning sun seep into my skin. I heard the soft clatter of plates and the low hum of a song playing from his phone speaker. When I finally got up and walked into the kitchen, I stopped in the doorway. He was standing at the stove, his back to me, wearing one of those old t-shirts that had been washed so many times it was almost see-through. His hair was a little messy, and there was a smudge of flour on his forearm. He was swaying to the music, not really dancing but not completely still either. For a moment I just watched him. Not because I was suspicious. Not because I was analyzing him. I just watched him like you'd watch a sunset or waves crashing on the shore. Peaceful. Familiar. Beautiful in its own quiet way. I felt my heart swell with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not love, not exactly. It was something deeper. A kind of gratitude for the person he was when no one was watching. Enjoying the show? He called without turning around. I smiled, stepping into the kitchen. Front row seats, baby. He laughed, flipping a pancake with a dramatic wrist flick. Don't get used to it. This is a limited time offer. Oh, trust me, I'm taking notes, I said, grabbing a mug from the cabinet and pouring myself a cup of coffee. I leaned against the counter, watching him with the same quiet affection I'd felt when I first saw him across a crowded party all those years ago. Funny how time changes the way you see someone, and funnier still how, sometimes it changes back. We sat together at the table that morning, eating pancakes that were a little too crispy on the edges but still good because he made them. We talked about little things, the neighbor's new dog, a movie he wanted to watch, the weird dream I'd had about riding a roller coaster with no seatbelts. Nothing deep, nothing profound. Just life. Normal, ordinary, beautiful life. At one point, he set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, looking at me with that thoughtful expression I'd come to recognize. The one that meant he was about to say something that had been sitting with him for a while. What's on your mind? I asked, taking a sip of my coffee. He tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he was still figuring out. Do you ever think about how close we came to missing all this? I blinked, surprised. What do you mean? He glanced down, rubbing his thumb along the edge of his plate. I mean, if we hadn't, done the work. I think about how easy it would have been to just keep going like we were. Both of us stuck in our heads, thinking the other one didn't care. We could have just coasted like that for years. He shook his head. I hate how close we were to losing it. I didn't say anything right away because honestly I'd had that exact same thought 100 times. Scared me too. Not just because of how close we'd come to drifting apart, but because I realized how normal that distance had felt. We'd lived in it for so long that it didn't even feel wrong. It felt normal. Yeah, I finally said, setting my mug down. But we didn't lose it. He looked at me, eyes steady, his jaw tight with that quiet kind of resolve I loved about him. No, he said firmly. We didn't. That conversation stuck with me for days. I kept thinking about how love stories aren't about not having problems, they're about fighting through them. About refusing to let distance win. Every movie, every book, every TV show makes it seem like the fight is some big dramatic event with shouting and tears, and someone chasing the other down in the rain. But the real fight? It looks a lot more like pancakes on a Saturday morning and quiet honesty at the table. Later that week, I decided to surprise him. It wasn't anything grand, just a little gesture to remind him I was thinking of him. I stopped by a store on my way home from work and picked up a box of his favorite candy. The one he always said was too expensive to justify buying for himself. I tucked it into his backpack so he'd find it at work. I didn't leave a note. I didn't need to. I just wanted him to know I was thinking of him. The next day, I got a text from him around 11 a.m. "You trying to make me cry at work? Not cool, babe. Not cool." I grinned at my phone, my heart warm in my chest. I sent back, "Just keeping you on your toes, old man." He replied with a heart emoji. Simple. Quiet. Perfect. These little moments stacked up. Days passed like that. Small gestures, small kindnesses, quiet reassurances that we were still here. Still fighting for this life we'd built. I'm not naive. I know there will be hard times again. We'll get tired. We'll get frustrated. We'll argue about stupid things like whether or not the towels need to be folded a certain way. But I think the difference now is that we'll notice it. We'll catch it before it grows. One night, while we were lying in bed, I reached out for him the way I had before. He didn't hesitate. He turned toward me, curling his arm around my waist and pulling me in like I was his favorite thing to hold. For a moment I just lay there, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against my back. I could feel his heartbeat, calm and sure. "Hey," he murmured, his voice heavy with sleep. "Yeah," I whispered. "Thanks for not giving up on me." My eyes stung with tears, but I kept them closed, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You didn't give up on me either," I said softly. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice fading into sleep. "I never will." I stayed awake for a little while longer, letting the weight of that promise settle in my chest. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. And sometimes real is better than perfect. The next morning, I woke up to find him still next to me, his face peaceful, his mouth slightly open as he snored just a little. I didn't roll my eyes this time. I didn't nudge him to stop. I just lay there watching him like I watched him at the stove that Saturday morning.
No suspicion.
No doubt. Just love. I don't know if every couple gets to have this moment. The moment where you realize that love isn't a feeling you have, it's a choice you keep making. Every day. Over and over. Some days it's easy. Some days it's hard. But the choice is always there. And if you're brave enough to keep making it, you get to have something that's better than perfect. You get something real. And that's all I've ever wanted. Not the fairy tale, not the grand sweeping romance. Just this. It's funny, isn't it? I started this whole thing thinking I was testing him. I thought I was proving something about his loyalty, his faithfulness, his heart. But in the end, the only person who got tested was me. And I'm proud to say that I passed. No more masks. No more experiments. Just two people who finally decided to notice each other again. And every day we keep choosing. A few months passed and life settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in a long time, alive. Not just functional. Not just okay. But truly alive. There was an ease between us that hadn't been there before. It wasn't about perfection or getting everything right. It was about effort. Genuine, messy, human effort. One evening we decided to go for a walk after dinner. It wasn't planned. We'd finished eating and I'd glanced at the clock, noting that there was still an hour or so of daylight left. He was scrolling on his phone, not really paying attention to anything in particular. I don't know what made me do it, but I tossed a dish towel at him. It hit him square in the chest. "Come on," I said, grinning as he looked up at me, confused. "Let's go for a walk." He squinted at me like I just suggested we climb Mount Everest. "A walk?" "Yeah, 2 feet forward motion, fresh air. It's all the rage these days," I said, folding my arms. He stared at me for another second, then shook his head, a small smile creeping onto his face. All right. Let me get my shoes." We didn't go far. Just around the neighborhood, past the rows of houses that all looked a little too similar. The streetlights had started to flicker on, their soft glow spilling onto the sidewalk. The air had that crisp, cool smell of early autumn, leaves just starting to dry out, distant hints of firewood from someone's backyard. I loved that smell. It reminded me of fresh starts. We walked side by side, our hands occasionally brushing against each other. I glanced at him, noticing how the shadows of the streetlights moved across his face as we passed beneath them. His features had changed since we first met. There were faint lines at the corners of his eyes now, the kind you get from laughing too much or squinting in the sun. His jawline wasn't as sharp as it had been when he was 25, but I loved it more now. It looked solid, strong, reliable. "What?" he asked, catching me staring at him. "Nothing," I said, smiling as I looked ahead. "Just thinking." "About what?" He nudged me with his elbow. "About how we look older now," I admitted. "But I think I like it." He gave me a look like he wasn't sure if I was serious or not. "Older, huh? Don't act surprised," I teased. "You have a gray hair, Mr. Denial." "Lies," he muttered, running his hand through his hair. "Left side near the temple." I pointed out with mock precision. "It's distinguished. Very wise grandpa energy." He groaned, rubbing his face with both hands. "All right, that's it. I'm getting hair dye." "Don't you dare," I said, grabbing his arm to stop him from walking ahead of me. "I like it. Makes you look seasoned." "Seasoned?" He raised an eyebrow. "Like a steak." "Exactly like a steak," I said, laughing. "Aged to perfection." He rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his grin. We kept walking. At some point, I reached out and took his hand without thinking about it. He didn't say anything, just squeezed my fingers lightly. I glanced at him again, and he was looking straight ahead, his expression soft and steady. It's strange how something as simple as holding hands can feel so new after being together for so long. When we first started dating, holding hands felt electric. It was a signal. Promise. Then, somewhere along the way, it became something you do without thinking. But now it felt intentional again. Chosen. And that made all the difference. As we rounded the last corner before heading back home, I spotted a small crack in the sidewalk. It wasn't big, but it caught my attention because I'd tripped over it once before. I slowed down, nudging him with my elbow. "Careful," I said, pointing at it. "Crack ahead." He glanced down, stepping over it like it was nothing. "Look at you, saving my life and everything," he joked. "Don't forget it," I replied, brushing off imaginary dust from my shoulder like a hero in an action movie. He laughed, and I felt it settle into my chest the way warmth settles into your bones on a cold day. I'd missed that sound. Not the polite laugh he gave people at work. Not the forced laugh you use when you're trying to keep the peace, but his real unfiltered belly-deep laugh. The one that made him tilt his head back just a little. When we got home, he opened the door for me like it was second nature. Not because he had to, not because it was some grand romantic gesture, but because it was us. The little things that don't make it into love stories but make up 90% of love itself. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I stared up at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the fan. He was next to me, his arm draped across his chest, eyes closed. But I knew he wasn't asleep. I could always tell. "Can I ask you something?" I said, my voice quiet in the dim light. He murmured, not opening his eyes. "Do you ever wish you'd married someone different?" I don't know why I asked it. It just slipped out like a stone I'd been carrying in my pocket for too long. I regretted it as soon as I said it, but it was too late to take it back. He didn't answer right away. He let out a slow breath, and I braced myself for whatever was coming. Then he turned his head to look at me, his eyes clear and sharp in the dark. "No," he said, like it was the simplest truth in the world. "Never." I blinked, staring at him, my throat tight with something I couldn't name. "Not even once?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "Not even once," he repeated. Then he reached out, brushing his fingers against my cheek. "You know why?" "Why?" I whispered. "Because no one else would have fought for me the way you did." His thumb traced the edge of my jaw. "And no one else would have made me want to fight back." I closed my eyes, letting those words settle over me like a blanket. I didn't say anything else after that. I didn't have to. I just shifted closer to him, pressing my face against his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing against me. We didn't fall asleep right away. We just lay there, holding on. No one tells you how much of marriage is just holding on. Through the hard days, the quiet days, the days when you're not sure if you're doing it right. You just keep holding on. And eventually the weight feels lighter. The next morning I woke up to find him already awake, scrolling on his phone like he always did. But this time when I glanced at him, he wasn't just mindlessly scrolling. He was looking at vacation spots. Thinking about going somewhere? I asked, sitting up and rubbing my eyes. He glanced at me, smirking. Yeah, thinking we deserve a break. I raised an eyebrow. Oh? And where exactly do you plan on taking me, Mr. World Traveler? Don't know yet, he said, turning the phone toward me. There were photos of beaches, cabins in the woods, little bed and breakfasts with ivy-covered walls. But I figure anywhere with you is fine. I rolled my eyes, but I was smiling. God, he's cheesy. But I didn't care. Not one bit. All right, I said, leaning against him, my cheek pressed to his shoulder. Just as long as there's Wi-Fi. I'm not roughing it in the woods with no internet. Deal, he said, kissing the top of my head. And that was it. No grand declarations.
No dramatic climax.
Just two people who'd nearly lost each other but decided, day by day, to stay. To notice each other. To choose each other. People always think love is the big moments. Proposals, anniversaries, grand speeches in front of a crowd. But I don't think that's it. Love is the walk after dinner. It's pancakes that are a little too crispy. It's catching cracks in the sidewalk before the other person trips. And it's holding on. Every day. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. And I'm never letting go. The following weeks passed quietly, but not in the way that silence feels tense or awkward. It was the kind of quiet that feels safe. The kind of quiet where you don't have to fill every moment with words to prove something. We had found a rhythm again. Not the one we had in the early days, but a new one. A better one. I think that's the part people forget to tell you about love. It doesn't stay the same, and it's not supposed to. It changes, shifts, grows, shrinks, and sometimes it feels like it's barely hanging on. But if you're lucky, it grows back stronger than before. One night, I found him sitting on the back porch. The air was cool, and the sky was streaked with purple and deep blue as the sun dipped below the horizon. He had a blanket draped over his lap and a beer bottle dangling from his fingers. I watched him from the kitchen for a moment before stepping outside. The wooden planks creaked under my feet, but he didn't turn around. He knew I was there. He always did. Mind if I join you? I asked softly. Only if you promise not to bring up work, he said with a grin, tilting his head back to look at me. His eyes caught the fading light just right, and for a second I felt that same rush I'd felt the first time I saw him smile at me all those years ago. It was wild to think that after everything, all the arguments, the silences, the doubt, he could still do that to me with just a look. No work talk, I agreed, sliding onto the chair next to him. The air was crisp and I tucked my feet up beneath me, pulling his blanket halfway over my lap. He didn't complain. For a while we just sat there watching the sky change colors. The sounds of the neighborhood filtered in, distant cars, the rustle of leaves, a dog barking somewhere down the street. I glanced over at him, taking in the relaxed set of his shoulders, the way he leaned back with his eyes half closed like he didn't have a care in the world. It wasn't always like this. I remembered the nights when we sat in silence but didn't feel close. How I'd scroll on my phone while he did the same, and we'd be inches apart but miles away. But tonight this silence felt different. Felt like being home. Do you think we would have ended up here if none of that had happened? I asked, my eyes still on the sky. Here, like on this porch? He teased, taking a sip of his beer. I rolled my eyes, nudging him with my elbow. You know what I mean. He was quiet for a moment, turning the bottle slowly in his hand, his thumb tracing the label. Probably not, he admitted. I think we'd still be, I don't know, going through the motions, I guess. Doing the we're fine thing. He glanced at me. You. Same, I said, exhaling slowly. I think I would have kept telling myself it was enough. He nodded, his eyes back on the sky. Funny how something has to break before you notice it's broken. Yeah, I murmured, pulling the blanket tighter around me. But at least we noticed. He glanced over at me, his expression serious but not heavy. Yeah, we did. The next day, I got home from work earlier than usual. I was still untangling my earbuds when I walked in and smelled something cooking. Not just cooking, sizzling. Like something on the stove, hot and fresh. I peeked into the kitchen and saw him standing there, spatula in hand, turning chicken breasts in a pan. Since when do you cook dinner on a Tuesday? I asked, dropping my bag on the counter. He turned, eyebrows raised like I'd caught him in the act of something scandalous. Since you said you had a rough week, he replied like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Figured I'd give you one less thing to think about. I blinked, caught off guard. It wasn't like he'd never made dinner before, but it was always something simple, a frozen pizza, maybe takeout if I was lucky. But this? Fresh chicken, mashed potatoes on the stove, even a bowl of salad on the side. It wasn't gourmet, but it was effort. And effort matters. Don't get used to it, he added, flipping the chicken again with a flick of his wrist. This is a one-night-only event. I said, biting back a smile as I leaned against the counter watching him. Guess I should savor it then. Damn right, he muttered, but he was smiling too. We sat down to eat, and I didn't realize how much I'd needed it until I took the first bite. Not just the food, but the feeling of being taken care of. It's easy to forget how good that feels when you're so used to being the one doing all the caring. I glanced at him as he poured himself another glass of water, his eyes on his plate, focused on cutting his chicken. He didn't look up. He wasn't waiting for praise or thanks. He just did it because he wanted to. Hey, I said, and he finally glanced up. Yeah. Thank you, I said, meeting his eyes. For this. For all of it. He paused, his gaze lingering on me like he was trying to figure out if I really meant it. I did. I saw him understand that in the way his face softened. You don't have to thank me, he said, but his voice was quieter now. But you're welcome. The days kept passing like that, and I found myself doing little things for him too. Not out of obligation, not to even the score, but because I wanted to. I'd refill his water bottle before bed without him asking. I'd leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror with dumb jokes or little compliments, just to make him smile. Sometimes I'd surprise him by picking up his favorite snack when I went grocery shopping, the kind of small, thoughtful gestures that get lost in the chaos of everyday life. One night I left a note on his pillow that just said, I still choose you. The next morning when I woke up, there was a note next to it in his messy handwriting that said, I choose you too. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding that little scrap of paper in my hands, feeling my throat tighten. It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't a big romantic gesture. It was two people saying the same thing at the same time on two sides of the bed. And that was enough. Later that week we went out for dinner. Not for an anniversary, not for any special reason at all. Just because. We sat at a little table by the window, our drinks sweating in the dim glow of hanging lights. Our waitress asked, Are you celebrating anything tonight? He glanced at me, then shrugged, smiling at her. Yeah, he said. We're celebrating us. Her eyes lit up with that warm, knowing smile waitresses give when they see a couple still choosing each other after all this time. Well, congratulations, she said, grinning as she wrote it down on her notepad. I laughed, leaning toward him as she walked away. Celebrating us? I teased. You just wanted a free dessert, didn't you? Absolutely, he said without hesitation, his grin wide and unrepentant. I laughed harder than I had in weeks, and he just sat there, watching me with that same steady, warm look I'd grown to recognize.
No pretenses.
No distance.
No masks.
Just us. I think people look for the big moment to know if their relationship is working. Some kind of sign. But it's never a moment. It's a series of small choices. A walk after dinner. Crispy pancakes on a Saturday morning. Deleting an app you don't need anymore. Cooking chicken on a Tuesday just because. It's sticky notes on a pillow that say, I still choose you. It's the quiet, steady promise of noticing. So no, I don't think love is fireworks or grand speeches in the rain. Love is simpler than that. It's holding on. It's holding out. It's holding each other. And we're still holding on. Every day we choose. The next few months passed in a way that felt different. Not the kind of different that comes with big sweeping changes, but the quiet, subtle kind. The kind that sneaks up on you. I started noticing things about him that I hadn't noticed in a long time. Like the way he always taps his fingers on the steering wheel when he drives, keeping time with whatever song is playing. Or how he folds his t-shirts a little differently than I do. And for years it used to annoy me, but now I just let it be. I think that's love too, learning which things to let go of. It wasn't just him though. I started noticing things about myself. Like how often I filled the silence with complaints about work or stress instead of sharing the things that actually made me happy. I'd gotten into the habit of talking about everything that was wrong in my day but barely mention what went right. I didn't want to be that person anymore. I didn't want to be the reason our house felt heavy when it didn't have to. One night, after a long day at work, I decided to try something different. Instead of coming home and launching into my usual rant about emails and deadlines, I told him one good thing that had happened. "You'll never believe it," I said, tossing my bag on the couch and kicking off my shoes. "But Jessica actually complimented my work today. Said I handled the project perfectly. Can you believe that?" He looked up from his phone, his face lighting up with genuine surprise. "No way," he said, his grin slowly growing. "Jessica? As in Jessica who never gives anyone credit, Jessica. The one and only," I said, laughing as I sat next to him. "I swear, I almost asked her if she was feeling okay." He chuckled, reaching over to squeeze my knee. "Look at you. Killing it out here." That little moment stayed with me. Not because it was huge but because of how easy it felt. We'd fallen into this pattern for so long of sharing our frustrations and ignoring our wins. But that night it felt like we'd flipped the script. And it felt good. The next morning, I woke up to a sticky note on the bathroom mirror. It wasn't one of my notes. His handwriting was messy, slanted to the right, and I knew it was his as soon as I saw it. It said, "Remember, you're better than you think you are." I stared at it for a long time, brushing my teeth with a grin I couldn't shake. After that, the sticky notes became a thing. I'd leave one on his coffee mug that said, "Don't forget, you're smarter than half your coworkers, and better looking too." He'd leave one on my desk that said, "Today's goal. Make Jessica eat her words again." It was a small, silly tradition, but it made me feel seen. I hadn't realized how much I missed feeling seen. One day, I came home to find him in the garage. He was hunched over an old box, sorting through things I hadn't seen in years. Photos, old souvenirs, random trinkets that we'd shoved away after we moved in together. "Spring cleaning in October?" I asked, stepping inside. "Figured it was time," he said, holding up a small ceramic dolphin with a missing fin. "I'd bought it at a gift shop during our first road trip together. Remember this?" I rolled my eyes, laughing. "Of course. You told me it was a waste of money." "Yeah," he said, turning it over in his hands. "I was wrong about that." I walked over and crouched next to him, looking at all the random objects from our past. Ticket stubs, old birthday cards, a photo of us at a Halloween party dressed as a pair of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I picked up the photo, tracing the edge with my thumb. "God, we looked ridiculous," I muttered. He leaned over, glancing at the picture. "We looked happy." I glanced at him, surprised by the softness in his voice. He was still staring at the photo, his eyes distant but focused at the same time. "We still are," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. He turned to me then, his eyes locking onto mine. "Yeah," he said, his voice firm. "We still are." That night, we stayed up later than usual. We didn't watch TV or scroll on our phones. We just talked. About old memories, about places we wanted to go. About stupid little dreams that felt too silly to share before. He told me he'd always wanted to learn how to play the piano. I laughed, not because it was funny but because I'd never known that about him. 7 years together, and I'd never known he had that dream. "Do it," I said, nudging him with my foot as we sat on the living room floor, surrounded by old photos. "Do what?" "Learn the piano," I said. "Why not?" He snorted. "Because I'm 35 and have the patience of a goldfish." "So?" I shrugged. "You think Mozart came out of the womb playing symphonies?" "No. He learned. You can too." He glanced at me, his eyes narrowing like he was thinking it over. "If I do it, you have to do something too," he said, pointing at me. "Something you've always wanted to do but never had the guts to try." I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "I don't know," he said, tilting his head in mock thought. "You've always said you wanted to write a book." I opened my mouth to protest, but he cut me off with a grin. "Don't even try it. I've heard you say it at least 10 times. I sighed, leaning my head back against the couch. "Fine. You learn piano, I'll write the book." "Deal," he said, holding out his hand. I shook it, feeling a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. The next day, he ordered a tiny keyboard online. It wasn't fancy, just something to practice on. I bought a new notebook and wrote chapter 1 at the top of the first page. I didn't know where the story would go, but I figured that was kind of the point. For the next few weeks, our house was filled with new sounds. The plink-plunk of awkward piano keys as he tried to learn Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and the quiet scratch of my pen on paper as I wrote scenes that would probably never make it into a real book. It was messy. It was clumsy. But it was alive. One night, after another round of failed piano practice, he flopped onto the couch next to me, groaning like a man twice his age. "This was a terrible idea," he muttered, covering his face with his hands. I laughed, setting my notebook aside. "You sound like me every time I try to write a paragraph." He peeked at me through his fingers. "You quitting?" "Not a chance," I said, crossing my arms. "You." He sat up, his face scrunched like he was seriously considering it. Then he shook his head, his lips curving into that grin I knew too well. "Nope. I'm too stubborn." "Good," I said, nudging him with my foot. "Me too." And that was it. Two stubborn people sitting on a couch refusing to give up on things they started just because it was hard. Somewhere in all of it, the music, the writing, the notes on the mirror, the late-night talks on the back porch, I realized that we weren't fixing anything.
We wären theebroken.
We just stopped paying attention for a while. And now we were paying attention again. That's the thing about love. It's not something you set and forget. It's something you have to choose every day. You have to be curious about each other. You have to ask, "What's on your mind?" and actually listen to the answer. You have to leave sticky notes on mirrors just to say, "I see you." I don't know if we'll ever get it perfect, but I do know this: I'm still choosing him. Not just for the person he was when we met, but for the person he's becoming. And every day he chooses me too. That's love. Not grand gestures. Not movie-worthy speeches. Just two people sitting on the floor, holding old photos and broken souvenirs, saying, "We still are. And we still are." Every day we choose.